I'm not an economist, but I don't think you need to be an economist to look at the Russian economy and think this is not sustainable long term. You're seeing inflation very high, interest rates very high. You're seeing this distortion of the Russian economy where everything is being driven by the war. You're seeing areas of Russia where recruitment sign-on bonuses and death bonuses are basically driving the local economies. And this is creating massive distortions to the Russian economy. You're seeing unemployment being very, very low, but that's not a good thing because they're not being able to find people to work in the armaments plants or the, in transportation infrastructure. So yeah, I don't think it's sustainable long term. I think the problem is, although it isn't sustainable long term, it's sustainable in the short to medium term. So I think pressure needs to be increased on the Russian economy. I think we need to see more sanctions. We need to see more sanctions on the most productive parts of the Russian economy, which is the oil and gas industry. I think one good thing the Trump administration has done is they've reportedly been pressuring Hungary and Slovakia to remove their purchases and their dependence on Russian oil and gas, which is great. I mean, it's purely selfish from an American perspective because they want them to buy American oil and gas instead. But still, it's a good step.
And so President Putin walks a sort of tighter line than he would perhaps like us in the West to think.
I think for the Russians, they still think that they can outlast Ukraine. They still think they can outlast Western support for Ukraine, but the Russian situation is not particularly rosy, neither on the battlefield nor in the economic sense or even the diplomatic sense. And there are signs that their isolation is slightly coming to an end. But okay, they're generally less isolated within the countries where Russia is traditionally strong. So you're seeing relatively good relationships with India, you're seeing relatively good relationships with China, DPRK, for example. But these are not the countries that Russia really wants to have good relations with. Obviously, they want to have good relations with those countries, but what they want is to have the relationships that they had with Europe. They want to be able to sell oil and gas to Europe again. They made an absolute fortune selling gas to Europe. Gazprom was one of the most profitable companies in Russia, and now it's essentially going bankrupt. Selling gas to China, for example, just doesn't compare to selling gas to Europe in terms of profit. Even if you assume that they can build this proposed Siberian 2 pipeline before the end of the decade, which they probably can't, it's still going to be far more expensive just because it's a far longer route to take. And the Chinese are going to scalp them in terms of the price that they're willing to pay. The Indians are scalping them on the price of oil. They're buying it at a discount, they're selling it at a massive profit. So yeah, for the Russians, they want to be able to have a good relationship with the countries they traditionally had good relationships with. They want to be able to sell oil and gas to Europe. They can't do that at the moment. So they are still relatively isolated in that regard.
Poland was hit with several Russian drones only a few days ago. Do you think the reaction of NATO was enough to send any sort of message to the Russians not to try something like this again?
I definitely think that they have sent a message, and that message is our response was weak. So please do something like this again, escalate further, because your escalation isn't going to be punished. What we've seen constantly is Russia escalating and the West refusing to either meet that escalation or to escalate on its own. And I think this has been a history of Russian bad behavior not being punished, and the Russians understanding that they can keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. It goes back to Crimea. They annexed Crimea. They didn't really get punished for it. So what did they do next? They invaded eastern Ukraine. They really didn't get punished for it. So what did they do next? And it keeps going on. And until Russia meets a solid pushback, they will keep escalating. I actually think that if Putin, his calculation in invading Ukraine firstly, he didn't expect Ukraine would resist in the way that it has, but it also didn't expect the West would support Ukraine in the way it has. So I think what you see is that it's actually more dangerous when you don't stand up to a country like Russia, because they maybe falsely assume that they can be more aggressive than they actually can be. I think if we'd have stood up to Russia in 2014, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now, almost certainly.
And yeah, the Netherlands and the Czech Republic have said they're sending air defences to Poland. France is sending Rafale fighter jets. Lithuania as well, also with a border very close to Russia, will receive a brigade of German troops. I mean, will any of that send an effective message to the Kremlin, or at least be the basis for further European action, do you think?
I don't think so. So we've seen a Russian incursion into Poland, and what have we done? Instead of punishing Russia, we've just essentially increased our defensive posture in Poland. Okay, great. What does that say? It says we're going to be constantly reactive. We're always going to react to what Russia does rather than being proactive. We could, for example, declare an air defense identification zone within Ukraine. We could say, hey, along the Ukrainian border, 150 kilometers into Ukraine, we're going to treat any Russian munition that enters this as a potential threat to NATO, and we're going to shoot it down. Perfectly practical, justifiable considering the Russian actions, and feasible. There'd be no risk of escalation because Russian manned aircraft don't go that far into Ukraine. Russian manned aircraft don't go into Ukraine generally, or at least not the unoccupied areas of Ukraine, because they get shot down by Ukrainian air defense. So there are many things that we could do, many practical things that we could do, but there just needs to be political will to do it. And at the moment, unfortunately, that doesn't exist.
And there was effectively no response from President Trump. Obviously, a lot of quite shocking news coming out of the US this week. But should that lack of response from the US on this be almost more of a worry for European partners than the actual incursion by these drones itself?
Yeah, I think it's worrying. I think the problem with Trump is, he can say anything at one moment and then turn around and say something completely different the next. I think with the Americans and the Trump administration, it's always worth watching what they do rather than what he says. But for sure, if you're Poland, you're going to be very, very worried that your key ally, the United States, is essentially whitewashing the most serious incursion into Polish airspace since Poland became a free country again.
But it doesn't necessarily then imply that the US has stepped back or given up on the ideas that were being discussed of after the war is finished, there being possibly US air cover or US support for a European peace force in Ukraine.
I don't think so. And again, the problem that the Trump administration is so chaotic. I don't think anyone has any idea what they're actually thinking or what they're going to do from minute to minute. A week ago or a week and a half ago, the Polish president was in DC, and Trump was talking about increasing troop levels in Poland. So, which is it? Is this a US that's pulling back from Eastern Europe, or is this a US that's increasing troop levels in Poland? It's, again, their position changes from day to day, and it's very difficult to know if there's a coherent policy at all. I don't think there is a coherent policy in regards to Russia, unfortunately.
And you are based here in Kyiv, Jimmy. Do you think many here are taking the idea of European security guarantees or some sort of peace force particularly seriously at the moment, given that they can only come after a peace deal, which we don't seem to be any closer to getting than when it was first proposed by President Trump?
No, I don't. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, the best security guarantee is the Ukrainian military. That I think that kind of part of the reason why you're seeing these military reforms now is the Ukrainians realizing that unfortunately nobody is going to come in and save them. It's really a case of they're going to have to win this war by themselves, really, with some external aid, of course, in terms of armaments and funding, etc. But Russia is only going to be deterred in future by a Ukraine that, as Ursula von der Leyen said, resembles a steel porcupine that can defend itself against any potential Russian incursion, or at least make any future Russian incursion so costly that they don't want to try it again.
And you mention that spikiness that Ukraine is trying to create within its defensiveness. One of those new spines, if you will, has come in the form of the long-range missile, the FP5 or the Flamingo. The impact of Kyiv's long-range strikes is sometimes played down. We're now starting to see fuel prices going up at the pump in Russia. Is it something that the Kremlin will be paying attention to, at least, when they're calculating how much longer they can carry on this invasion?
Absolutely, they have to. And it's not just the Flamingo, it's the Ukrainian domestic drone program. It's a number of other systems. They have Long Neptune, which is a improved version of the Neptune anti-ship missile, which sunk the Moscow cruiser. They have Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which borrowed of the UK and France. And all of these systems provide, an offensive punch for Ukraine that Moscow has to reckon with. The other thing I think you should definitely remember is that Ukraine also has this incredible kind of guerrilla mentality when it comes to attacking Russia. So we saw in Operation Spiderweb, the SBU using FPV drones hidden in trucks. There's always the risk of something like this happening again because Ukrainians are incredibly proficient at operating inside Russia. Every Ukrainian can speak Russian, almost every Ukrainian can speak Russian. They can pass as a native Russian speaker relatively easily. Russians can't do that in Ukraine. Most Russians don't speak Ukrainian. Most Russians can't, they can't hit those cultural, touchstones that Ukrainians can. Because most Ukrainians were raised in a culture where Russian music, Russian literature, Russian television, films were dominant because of cultural repression. So from from a Ukrainian perspective, that's actually very advantageous to them if they're running operations inside Russia, because they can just pass as a native Russian. They can make all the cultural references that a Russian can. They can speak perfect Russian with a perfect Russian accent. And we've seen this multiple times with Ukrainian operations inside Russia.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.